just to accompany Chinese words with a quote, here is how the establishment of the Maison Française is announced to Louis Liard, Vice President of the Sorbonne at the time, at the same time as Henri Bergson's visit. I quote President Butler sending this letter. "It gave me the greatest possible pleasure to cable you on Thursday of the great pleasure and satisfaction that we have in being the recipients of a gift adequate to purchase and furnish a house in the immediate neighborhood of the university to serve as a Maison Française. We are proud and happy at this new acquisition and hope to have the house ready for the occupancy of the visiting French professor who shall come to us in October 1913. Professor Bergson, whose arrival we are expecting, is about a month's time and is to be my personal guest." Actually, when you look at the letters exchanged between them, President Butler insisted on having Bergson stay at his house. He was hoping that the presidential house, Columbia Presidential House, would be finished by the time Bergson comes, because he insisted, he and Mrs. Butler, on having the great French philosopher in their home. And then on September 13, 1911, this is another letter, now this time directly to Mr. Henri Bergson, Collège de France, Paris, France. "Sir," he calls. "On behalf of Columbia University, I venture to ask whether it would be at all possible for you to consider coming as our guest in the autumn of 1912, or if that be not possible, in the autumn of 1913, in order to deliver some lectures on philosophy and to stimulate by your personal presence and conversation our teachers and advanced students on that subject. Doubtless, the names of some of my colleagues in that field, particularly Professor Dewey, Woodbridge, Adler, and Montagu, are known to you." These were the professors at the philosophy department at the time. So one would expect this to be the encounter between Bergson and Dewey in particular, and Mathias Girel is going to speak on that topic later. So President Butler continues, "Perhaps you are aware that this university has a formal arrangement with the authorities of the University of Paris for the presence here in the autumn of each year of a visiting French professor. This year we are to have the pleasure of welcoming Monsieur Lançon, who will be with us during October, November, and a part of December. And then on January 10, dear sir has become my dear Professor Bergson, and the address is not the official address, Collège de France, but Professor Henri Bergson, Villa Montmorency, 10 Avenue des Tilleuls, Auteuil, Paris. My dear Professor Bergson, I have the honor to send you herewith formal notice of the fact that on the nomination of the Council of the University of Paris, notified to me on the date of December 26, 1911 by Monsieur Liard, you were, on Monday last, appointed by the trustees of Columbia University to be visiting French professor for the academic year 1912-13 and assigned during your stay at Columbia to a seat in the faculty of philosophy. So then he continues saying that the exact time and modalities are going to be determined, and added something informing him, I hope, that he could go back to France after his stay on either the Lusitania or the France, who are the best ships on the Atlantic Ocean, and insisting that the cabin had been reserved for Henri Bergson, to which Bergson is going to reply, actually saying that he might consider stopping on his way back in London. In that case, he would take the Lusitania, or maybe just go back straight back home, and in that case, he would take the France, which would take him to Le Havre then. So, the dates chosen for his conference at Columbia, Princeton, and Harvard suited him very well. Bergson answered President Butler insisted that if he really has to go to those savage lands, he should not let them take advantage of him, because he was recalling that the previous French visitor who went also to those savage lands that they called Harvard and Princeton came back very tired. So he insisted that Bergson just pay some short visit to those places. But Bergson mentioned something which is interesting, that since Harvard and Princeton had given him the choice of the language, he would speak in French. Explaining this, I will thus say much more clearly what I may have to say, but I will chat and discuss in English with the colleagues that I will meet. Actually, in other letters written by Bergson, he explained that although he is totally at ease in English, he would rather give his lectures in French, insisting on the point that he never exactly delivers what he has written or the notes he has taken, believing that there is a movement of what he has to say, and that basically the movement itself calls the right words. And this is something he would only be able to do in his first language, not in a second language. And so he insisted that he would give courses for the students, and that would be, they would be lectures, and also to the general public. But the lectures to the students would be in English and would be more technical, while the lectures for a larger audience would be in French. And he thought of sending a detailed outline at first for those lectures, but realized that the potential audience might think that the topic would be more difficult than it actually was. And Bergson makes the following precision, I quote him: "The form of the lectures will be simple enough for every cultivated mind to follow them exactly." He then insists very strongly on the point of having not too big a room for the lectures. I guess he had something like this in mind. He recalls that the couple of times when he had to speak in a large room, he had to push his voice, losing therefore the neatness of the enunciation. The lecture was ruined, say Bergson, and that question of acoustics, he insists, I'm quoting him, is of crucial importance for me, and that is the reason why I take the liberty of insisting particularly on it. Then follows, and this is more substantial, my colleagues and friends are going to be more substantial on Bergson. Now I'm just giving you the presentation of the 6 lectures as announced by Bergson under the general title Spirituality and Freedom. The first lecture had this outline: new trends in philosophy, the position of philosophy vis-à-vis science and vis-à-vis art, the crucial importance of the problem of the mind, the relationship of that problem to that of freedom. Some of the themes that are the themes of the essay on the immediate data of consciousness are obviously in here. The second lecture had the following outline: on the illusions into which intelligence naturally falls when addressing the problem of the mind and that of freedom. The ancients' belief in fate, the moderns' belief in the necessary determination of individual behavior and people's lives, the constant influence exercised by mathematics on the thought of the ancients and on those of the modern. The third lecture, on the relationship of the mind and the body. To what extent does the mental fact depend on the cerebral fact? This notion of the mental and the brain is central for us. Danger of ready-made theories. How did they sneak into the description and even the observation of facts? The necessity of coming back to experience pure and simple. This was supposed to be the third lecture. The fourth lecture, it given here by Bergson, was on the relationship between the mind and the body, continued, considering the body as oriented towards a particular given direction, as orienting towards a particular direction the attention of the mind, how the mind and the body can act on one another. The fifth lecture, the mind considered a force. So here he uses then the French phrase, l'élan psychique. I guess the best translation for this would be mind energy, since mind energy is the translation of his L'énergie spirituelle that Bergson was to publish 5 years after his visit here at Columbia. In 1918, he published L'énergie spirituelle, which is a collection of articles and lectures he gave, and he says that because his friends insisted, he had to publish those. Now I revisited my own L'énergie spirituelle in my library, looking for any of these lectures to appear in the selection. They don't. So he never selected any of the lectures he gave here at Columbia to be part of the volumes of articles. But as Frederick is going to show, they are actually very important for the rest of his publications. Because at the time of 1930, you have to remember, he had 3 main books, L'essai sur l'économie immédiate de la conscience, then Matter and Memory, and Creative Evolution at that time, 1889, 1896, and 1907 or 7, under the control of Frederick. So the fifth conference, the mind considered a force, mind energy, the meaning of certain maladies of the mind, the artificial nature of the difficulties raised about the problem of personality. Sixth and last lecture, spirituality and freedom. What use can a spiritual and free force be? Where from and where to? The meaning of individual and social life, the possibility of a metaphysics exclusively founded on experience. This last idea is very important, obviously. Before introducing my friend, I will just say a couple of words about the reception of Bergson in the press, but Larry is going to talk more about that. The New York Times insisted on the concept of intuition. Basically, this was a centerpiece in Bergson's presentation, and this was what was more striking from what he had to say. And the New York Times of February 7, 1913, had this title, Believes in Intuition. Bergson introduces this as one basis of philosophical solution. There are lighter articles in the New York Times, one later on February 20, about a university in honor of Henri Bergson, when the article says that more than 1,000 guests attended the tea, the university tea, and that the wives of members of the faculty presided at tea tables, which is very interesting information indeed. Under the title, Everything Si Vous Voulez. Also, the New York Times of February 5, 1913, gave a report on Bergson's first lecture. And it appears from the title that actually Bergson had the verbal tic of using that phrase, si vous voulez, which is something you have to pay attention to, because we say that very much in French when we are trying to explain anything. So avoid si vous voulez. Now, before Larry says more on Bergson's reception and the traffic jams his presence provoked here in the US, I cannot resist quoting the first lines of the article Si vous voulez from the New York Times. Professor Henri Bergson's first lecture, that of Monday afternoon, was delivered before a capacity crowd of officers, students, and guests of the university. There were many, practically all, in fact, of the members of the philosophy and romance faculties, present with a liberal sprinkling of other instructors. a large number of attractive French women lent color to the audience, but there were few undergraduates present. End of quote. Of course, no one today would dare speak of attractive French women bringing only color to a philosophical gathering. So let me just say that this audience that you are, in many respects, resemble the one Bergson had 100 years ago. So thank you all, you attractive American and French and global men and women, for bringing your color to this conference. Now I'm going to introduce my friend Larry McGrath, who works at Johns Hopkins University in the Humanities Center on European Intellectual History. And he is writing currently a dissertation on science and spirit in France from 1873 to 1907. 1907, you may have guessed from what I heard say earlier that it is Creative Evolution by Bergson. 1873, I will let him have the pleasure of explaining what that date corresponds to. Thank you.
Good evening. It was, it goes without saying, but actually Shani said it quite well, but it was thanks to Henri Bergson's first visit to the United States in February of 1913 that the very institution bringing us together this evening, the Maison Franc, could be founded. In fact, at the news of Bergson visiting just beforehand in the press, there was an anonymous donor who gave $30,000 to the institution, so pleased as he was about the arrival of Bergson. And as Bachir nicely pointed out, in addition to his kind introduction, was that Columbia's president at the time, Nicholas Murray Butler, invited Bergson, requesting first that he come as a guest in autumn of 1912. Pardon me. Columbia had an arrangement with the Université de Paris, which supported the visit of a French professor each autumn, and the council of the Université approved Bergson's delegation, but his teaching responsibilities, as he famously filled packed lecture halls at the Collège de France, which was supposed to be teeming with students coming out of the windows, made it so he couldn't come until the year afterwards. Bergson would spend 25 days in America from February 2nd to the 27th of that year. And Butler ensured that Columbia treated Bergson to a red carpet welcome, in fact. He expedited the construction of his new president's mansion. So yes, Nicholas Murray Butler did want Bergson to stay with him, but especially to show off his new pad. And while here at Columbia, Bergson presented a public lecture series, it deserves to be said again, all in French. It is striking to consider the celebrity that France's first superstar international philosopher achieved in America well before it would be cemented with his 1927 Nobel Prize in Literature. Indeed, commentators have frequently mentioned the Broadway traffic jam that was caused by the Bergson craze here in New York. And his celebrity was so appealing that tickets sold out here at Columbia to hear a French speaker who the majority of the audience could not even understand. He wasn't speaking at the Maison Franc, it was just before a general public. What deserves to be pointed out is that Bergson came at a time when European intellectuals claimed a cultural cachet among Americans. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung famously came to Clark University in 1909, and Bertrand Russell would visit Harvard in 1914. But Bergson's visit was unique for the popular prestige that he garnered while here. It suggests comparison with what has come to be known as French theory in the Academy, that milieu of post-structuralist thinkers, Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and company who, to borrow the subtitle of Francois Causet's book by the same name, transformed the intellectual life of the United States from the 1970s to today. While the academic influence of these thinkers continues to pervade American departments of literature, history, anthropology, cultural studies, and, to a much lesser extent, philosophy, the memory of Bergson's visit recalls an initial and perhaps even more forceful wave of French theory in America. Prior to Bergson's visit, Columbia invited, as Shane well pointed out, the literary critic Gustave Vincent, and as well, in the year before, in 1910, the French philosopher Émile Boutroux, who wrote in 1873 his thesis on the contingency of the laws of nature, a book that, at least in my research, very much anticipates the creative account of the contingency and creativity of nature that Bergson would identify in his third book, Creative Evolution. Columbia was at the cutting edge of what might be called then the first wave of French theory, well before the Johns Hopkins University hosted its 1966 conference, The Language of Criticism and the Science of Man, which marked the debut of America's fascination with post-structuralism. Indeed, at the time here, Columbia's Journal of Philosophy, Psychology, and Scientific Methods published myriad articles on Bergsonism, and Americans' towering pragmatist philosophers, William James and John Dewey, both corresponded privately with Bergson. Yet Bergson stands out not only for his academic influence, as I insist again, but more importantly his popular prestige. Indeed, The Sun, then the chief rival of the New York Times, announced on February 2nd, Professor Henri Bergson to arrive today. A famous Jewish philosopher will spend 3 weeks in this country. Bergson's arrival received ample attention in the New York City press at a time when Jewish intellectuals received little. Quote, "It is particularly fitting that Bergson should come to the United States," the Sun suggested, "for it is more directly associated with his philosophy than in any other part of the world. Popular enthusiasm manifested in the projection of hopes, desires, and fears onto his image, suggesting an urge on the part of many to at least adapt Bergson to American culture, and at most, claim him as their own." Writing as if its readership already knew that Bergson was in town, the Evening Post claimed, "There is every reason why the principles of Henri Bergson's philosophy should prove even more popular in this country than they have abroad." While at Columbia, as Bachir pointed out, Bergson gave 6 public lectures, Spiritualité et Liberté, and even though Bergson requested a small lecture room, since, as he claimed, it is impossible for me to obtain the clarity of articulation if I'm obliged to make an effort with my voice, Columbia nonetheless outfitted him with a large hall that filled 500 attendants. Adorned in academic cap and gown, Bergson opened the series by directing it at what he characterized as the sudden expansion of physical science, and how it informed what he saw as the dominant mathematical paradigm of philosophy. Bergson's engagement with the sciences drew on the focus of his corpus up until that point, which tackled advancements in the natural and human sciences of the late 19th century. His first 2 books took up the nascent scientific psychology. In L'essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience, or what we call time and free will, he examined the limitations of psychophysics, that is, the psychological method of measuring the duration of perception. In 1896, with Matter and Memory, he drew on the burgeoning psychopathological research on aphasics in particular, and forcefully argued against the localization of memory in the brain. And finally, in Creative Evolution of 1907, it was the most significant book that Bergson published up to that point, and when he arrived in New York, it was just following the English translation in 1911. One newspaper published the headline, "The Coming of the New Philosopher of Creative Evolution." In that book, Bergson critiqued the dominant models of Darwinian and Lamarckian evolutionary biology, as well as adaptationist theories of species divergence. In all of his major books, Bergson pursued scientific advancements up to their limits, that is, up to the point where positive scientific observation gives way to metaphysical speculation. And although Bergson would be understood in many Americans' minds, and in many minds still today, as a mystical or even occult thinker, I want to stress that his work remained in close dialogue with the natural sciences. In his Columbia lecture series, Bergson challenged the scope of the sciences by focusing on their limited ability to explain away free will. Drawing again on his corpus, Bergson defended a pragmatist, or what you might call anti-intellectualist, account of consciousness, which understands thought as an act of volition rather than an act of abstraction or representation. As he succinctly argued in his first lecture, will can create thought, but thought cannot create will. By the second lecture, Bergson had to, quote, fight his way through another record audience after at least 2,000 persons either made written application or asked in person for cards for the lecture, one newspaper read. He spent the lecture situating the will, which he posited as the faculty of creation, as the proper object of philosophy. A journalist summarized Bergson's talk as follows: science studies everything from the exterior, whereas philosophy studies everything from the interior. Now, it is difficult to discern whether Bergson was actually understood in everything that he just said, since his audience knew English, and not necessarily French, and since the available documentation of the lectures are all translations from the French in which he spoke, that is, by an English student. Against the recommendation of Nicholas Murray Butler that he speak in English, Bergson preferred to deliver the lectures in his native tongue. Above all, he wrote, there would be the advantage that in French I could speak them, while in English I would be obliged to read them. Bergson prided himself on his ability to speak freely without notes. He even claimed that oration was critical to the very nature of philosophy's presentation. I attribute a good part of the effect of my lectures, he wrote, to their being spoken lectures. During the lectures that I gave recently in London, I had articulated distinctly enough to be able to be followed even by those who had only a very superficial familiarity with French. Yet, whether or not his lectures were understood, Bergson's erratic effect was certainly not lost on his audiences. His lectures in French were delivered without notes, John Burroughs wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, in an animated conversational style, his hands within a narrow circle, being as active as his mind. The frail, thin, small-sized man with sunken cheeks, Burroughs continued, was somewhat nervous as he faced his American audience. But, as he proceeded with his lecture on spirituality and liberty, he grew eloquent, aroused his audience, and made a profound impression. Bergson certainly, as Bachir noted, made an impression on the women in the audience. As one newspaper wrote, there were all sorts in the audience: distinguished professors and editors, well-dressed women and overdressed women. The Sun insinuated that women only attended Bergson's lectures to enrich their social standing. Continuing, Professor Henri Bergson drew enormous audiences in his lectures in America simply because it became the fashion of the hour when it was taken up by the 400. I did a little research, and that was the number of New Yorkers who allegedly actually mattered enough and they could fit in one ballroom together. Interestingly, Bergson's public lectures were not even the most well-attended event here at Columbia. More than 1,000 showed up on February 20th to witness him sip tea with the wives of Columbia faculty. Occupying the public space at Bergson's lectures, dressing à la mode to boot, was a currency of cultural capital. The American woman in the audience could be more like une femme parisienne, who, as the New York Daily Eagle described, thinks it makes her pass for a blue stocking to be dressed in the latest fashion and to go hear a lecture at the Sorbonne or the Collège de France, and to hear such a philosopher as Henri Bergson, who lectures there. Women flock to hear him, and in that society, while closing their eyes in ecstasy, they talk of him as if he were a god. So one can only wonder just how ecstatic women supposedly felt while indulging in the rhythm of Bergson's French voice. But it is clear that the press packaged in gendered terms the prestige that sharing Bergson's air could confer. Bergsonism ultimately escaped Bergson's own control. The term was mobilized to link women in fashion in the public imagination, as a full-page article in the New York Tribune testified, and this was the favorite, my favorite document that I came across in the archives. This article was encouraging women to buy from American rather than French designers at the outbreak of the First World War. And I quote from it: "The Bergson habit of mind likely to affect dressmakers. Henri Bergson makes a great deal of money and, when he is in America, has a corking time. Divulging the information that a thing no sooner is than it is not. Our dressmakers will, if they have not already, soon get in the Bergsonian mood." On the other hand, Bergson's support for feminism and the suffrage movement here in the States has been well documented. He was interviewed regularly about his views on a host of social and political matters, from his opposition to anti-Semitism in Europe, to his admiration for racial diversity in America, and even his skepticism about Picasso's Cubism. Indeed, he was no fan of modern art at all. But one of the first interviews that Bergson conducted in New York City concerned the state of American education. The droll headline read, "Bergson on our schools says French students work harder than ours." The interviewed followed his talk on the role of the university in democracy at the City College of New York, the fourth university that he attended while here. There, Bergson drew his largest audience, all male high schoolers and collegians, who greeted him with 3 chants of their college yell. In idiosyncratic fashion, Bergson attached the university's democratic ambition to the idea that, as he put it, life is and must be continuous progress. Bergson completed his time in New York with a private seminar series here for Columbia's philosophy department, titled "The Method of Philosophy: Outline for a Theory of Knowledge." The seminar stands out for having been the only event at which Bergson spoke English, and one would assume that John Dewey was in attendance, as well as the department chair, Frederick Woodbridge, and Walter Pitkin. Pitkin is notable, it's worth adding, for having launched a debate over Bergson's thought in the department's journal, beginning with his article, "James or Bergson, or Who is Against the Intellect?" Pitkin argued that William James got Bergson thought wrong in his lectures published in what will become A Pluralistic Universe, and that Bergson's was the superior pragmatism. Pitkin urged, quote, "a perpetual injunction against every attempt to identify or even to harness up the radical empiricism of Cambridge with Parisian intuitionalism." Throughout his visit, Bergson was compared to William James, who died just 2 years before. There is every reason why the principles of Henri Bergson's philosophy, the Evening Post wrote, should prove even more popular in this country than they have been abroad. And the reason was that pragmatism, which in essence is very much the same thing as Bergsonism, the article claimed, has been imposed on philosophical speculation in this country by the high authority of William James. From another angle, The Sun reported, Professor Bergson had found a disciple in the late William James. Whether James influenced Bergson or, as another author claimed, Bergson had found the key for which James himself had been searching vainly, it was clear that a bond between the two had been forged in popular and academic culture. In light of the close relationship between Bergson and James, it is easy to think that Americans' first encounter with Bergson was also his own missed encounter with James. James and Bergson had met before in person, in fact, 3 times, but never on James' home soil. And given that Bergson had invited James in 1910 to Paris after having nominated him as an associate member of l'Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques, Bergson's visit had all the trappings of a reciprocal invitation. He opened his first public talk here at Columbia by acknowledging if America had produced only William James, she would have made a sufficiently great contribution to the world in the domain of philosophy and psychology. It was fitting that Bergson then delivered his final lecture here in America at Harvard, the former university of William James. His absence did not go unnoticed. In fact, James' son was in the audience and heaped praise on Bergson. The title was La Philosophie du Changement, the philosophy of change, and Bergson opened it by paying tribute to James. Bergson, of course, spoke in one of those, savage places? Princeton. on February 12th, giving a talk titled Philosophy and Common Sense. But when asked for the transcripts of the lecture, Bergson had none to offer. Indeed, like many of his lectures, he spoke extemporaneously. The 25 days that Bergson spent in America were packed. As Nicholas Murray Butler warned Bergson before he came, so soon as your coming is notified, you too will be overwhelmed with invitations to deliver addresses. Although Bergson accepted offers from Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, and City College, he declined even more offers, including, as I found in his dossier, the University of Pennsylvania, Yale, University of Chicago, and Ohio State. But the more striking documents that I found in Bergson's dossier were the myriad invitations from churches, Unitarian, Anglican, and Catholic, pleading Bergson to speak before their congregations. He didn't. Bergson certainly found himself in awe of his wide appeal in America. If he in fact inaugurated the first wave of French theory, as I'd like to suggest in America, then the Derridians of yesteryear would surely envy the cultural tsunami that was Bergsonism. In an interview conducted the morning of his February 27th departure in 1913, Bergson revealed, "I know of no other country where you could find such large and responsive audiences to listen to lectures on philosophy in French." If only America was still like that. Bergson would return to America twice amidst the tumult of the First World War. But his missions were diplomatic and not philosophical. Nonetheless, Bergson left an impressive philosophical stamp on America. It even touched the bout of seasickness that Bergson endured on his way home from America aboard the steamship, the France. One reporter questioned whether Bergson would have attributed his upset stomach to purely physical causes, as if it was just what he ate and just what how his stomach reaction, thereby renouncing the power of philosophical speculation. Thank you.
Frédéric is the director of the International Center for the Study of Contemporary French Philosophy and a professor of philosophy at the University of Lille. In fact, to introduce Frédéric in a couple of words is just to say that Bergson is back and very much alive, Bergsonism in France, and he had a huge role to play in that return of Bergson, or in that revive of Bergson to play on his latest book titled Revive. And Frédéric has done that since his PhD in 1995, devoted to Bergson. And he believes also in collective work. He has really created a movement around Bergsonism, being the director of Annales Bergsoniennes. He directed a critical edition of Bergson's oeuvre, and he just directed a lexicon of philosophy titled Sans mots de la philosophie, and he invited 9 French philosophers to be part of that, and I was happy to be one of those. So,
indeed, the widest and the most cruel gap in time that passed since Bergson's visit in Colombia a century ago might not be that centennial, however wide and large a century is. The centennial that we very happily and profoundly try to celebrate today. To the contrary, this centennial, to me indeed, should be the way to finally go beyond the damages of another gap in time, another space in time, I would say, in a phrase that I heard was not very correct in English. Un espace de temps or laps de temps. There is another gap of time that is more cruel and wider than the century itself. And this cruel gap of time is not the one you would think. It's not the centennial, and it's not also another gap that was very vivid and important, and that occurred immediately after Bergson's visit in 1913, and Larry alluded to it too, That is the gap in time that was linked to the outbreak of the First World War, which would see Bergson's come back to the US, this time with an official and special mission to the then president, Woodrow Wilson himself. So there are two very important gaps, the Centennial, between 1913 and now, and the First World War. But the most cruel and the most important gap that I want to deal with today very briefly is none of these two gaps. It's another one that maybe would give its meaning, its full meaning to the other two I mentioned. And this gap I want to deal with, to me it's the most significant, but it can be surprising in a way, because it is a gap between two periods in Bergson's philosophy itself. A gap between two interventions, two texts, two series of philosophical thoughts, the one he delivered here and the way it appeared in his own work a few years, actually around between 15 and 20 years later. It can be surprising. How can the time distance between some philosophical texts by the same author be more significant and actually give their meaning to the more obvious and critical times of the century, the 20th century, and of the war, the first one, and maybe even the Second World War, in a sense. This is, however, what I want to show, to defend today, to try and show to you tonight. What is very striking, indeed to me, when I read the summaries of both private and public lectures that you just heard Bergson did deliver here, when you read the summaries of both private and public lectures that Bergson gave here in Columbia in 1913, is the following fact. It is that both subjects, both questions that Bergson dealt with philosophically and orally in 1913 would be written down in his philosophical books, but very much later, namely and only in his two latest books. That is, his moral and political book that he published very late in his work in 1932, whose title you might remember, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, which was published very late in his work. He was more than 73 years old, so Bergson was one of the youngest and one of the oldest writing philosophers in the history of philosophy, with his first major book at less than 30 and his last major book at more than 70. So that is a big gap between what he said here and 1932, but there is another gap between what he said here and what he said in his last publication, which was the publication of his second collection of essays, called in French La Pensée et le Mouvement, and very tellingly translated in 1946. We don't know if Bergson approved of the title in English, but very tellingly translated into English as The Creative Mind. So there is Mind Energy, 1919, and The Creative Mind in 1946, the two collection of essays by Bergson, which very close title, Mind Energy and Creative Mind, but I won't go into that right now. And it is, what I want to show is that what Bergson taught in both his classes here, his seminars, here in 1913, would come up to the front, would be published only in 1932 and 1934, with a gap of 19 and 21 years, so 20 years, so to speak. But the gap is not only a theoretical distance, it is a historical and also political distance, and in fact it has something of a tragedy. What Bergson said here, which was quite important, became inaudible in the 30s. What was central in the beginning of the century, the 1910s, was inaudible 20 years later. So the gap between the oral and the written versions is actually tells something about the 20th century in philosophy and also in politics. That's what I want to show. And there is a third gap that I want to mention, and I will go very briefly into the 3 points. The third gap is between Bergson's political mission in 1917 and 18, and the account he gave of that in 1936, in a very seldom piece of autobiography that he wrote, and whose title is very telling too. It's called in French Mes missions, my missions, giving to his political embassy to Woodrow Wilson both diplomatic meaning, mission, it's administrative language, and a mystical meaning. Mission is also, of course, messianism, and so he gave this word mission, both the technical and the mystical meaning. So you have three gaps, and I want to go very briefly to three of them. The first one would deal with what Bergson taught in his private class here, the reserved class. He wanted to reserve a technical class in philosophy for, as we heard, advanced students and colleagues only. Private seminar, as they say in the Collège de France. We have in the Collège de France the private seminar and the public class. So actually he would reproduce here in Colombia the structure of the teaching in the French Collège de France. And what he wanted to teach, but of course he didn't succeed because he didn't succeed to restrict the audience, and it would be the private seminar would be very public, but you know, it's Bergson's ambivalence towards publicity and popularity that you encounter with the pretext of the voice. Of course, it's not only the voice; it's the relationship to popularity. What he wanted to teach in his private class is method dealing with theory of knowledge. And actually the title is very surprising. The title that we found in the summary, it is called A Sketch for a Theory of Knowledge, which is very modest for a philosopher being at the height of European philosophy at the time. A sketch for a theory of knowledge. But this title is very telling. It shows us that what Bergson wants to present to his American audience is both difficult because it is reserved, and new, because it is a sketch for a theory of knowledge, which could, of course, be somewhat shocking because he published 3 books. It ignited the quarrel over Europe and America, and now he wants to tell us that he didn't have any theory of knowledge, and it's only in 1913 that he's going to present it. Actually, what is new is very important. In 1913, here in America, Bergson is presenting a new theory of knowledge, or is more precisely making clear the new theory of knowledge that he reached in 1907 in the creative evolution. And it is a theory different from the preceding one, different from the one that William James had liked so much, different from the one that has ignited what is now called the quarrel, the war of Bergsonism. Bergson here, to put it in a word, what Bergson defended here in Colombia, contrary to what he defended and was best known for, is that there is no general theory of knowledge. There is no general knowledge to be criticized. There is no general intelligence, intellectual knowledge that philosophy would have to criticize. To put it in a word, there is no general concept of concepts. There is no generality of knowledge that you have to destroy. What he defends here, and then I quote, I'm quoting the summary we have. We don't have the text of the class, we have just the summary, but the summary is very telling. What Bergson writes here, or what is reported here, I quote, is that what Professor Henri Bergson taught to his American audience is, quote, some concepts are natural, many are artificial, and the most important sentence is the following. There is no theory, explanation, or critique that holds for all concepts at the same time. So you have some concepts that are made by the human mind, that do not have any correspondence into reality. You have some concepts that are real, and for possibilities, for example, mathematical concepts applying to the spatial matter of the universe, so that physics is true, because you can apply physical concepts to physical reality. But the most important point is that for every single concept in human knowledge, you have to make a different critique. Some of them are grounded, some of them are not, and you have to make a special theory for every single concept, which is totally new because Bergson was famous for what we just heard, that he criticizing all concepts for the sake of intuition. So what you know now is that, of course, you want to reach a knowledge without concepts, and in the summary you can still find this pretension. But what you have to do is make an individual study of every concept in our knowledge. This is a major breakthrough in Bergson's philosophy, and a breakthrough that would appear only with no reference to the Columbia lectures in 1934, in the beginning of the second part of the introduction to the creative mind. And no one noticed the change in Bergson's philosophy, except for one great commentator, whose name was Georges Canguilhem, major French philosopher of the center of the century. Georges Canguilhem, who noticed that Bergson changed his philosophy of knowledge in 1934, not knowing that it was here in 1913 that it occurred first. So you have to remember that Bergson is not the dualist that we know. It's not only intuition, which is true, and concepts that are fictitious. Among concepts, you have true and false concepts, and you have to make a single theory for every concept. Bergson is not the irrationalist, the general critique of rationality that he was branded at the time, that the Sun and the New York Times were so fascinated with. So it's more complicated. But no one noticed. It appeared only 15 years, 20 years later. The second gap is much more important and tragic, even. It has to do with ethical and political subjects. And the gap that occurred between the oral presentation here and the written statement 20 years later proved a disaster in Bergson's reception. It proved a disaster because what he presented here was the beginning of his writing on ethics that he started to write about after 1907, and it would take 25 years to get to the final statement of his ethics. In the meantime, after 1907, all cultural Europe had built Bergson ethics for him. I mean, building like futurism in Italy, vitalism, the morals of Elan Vital, the politics of Elan Vital. Everybody thought that he had Bergsonian ethics. Everybody but Bergson, who didn't give it ethics. It would take him 25 years. What he said here is that you have not only an ethics of Elan Vital, that he would find the criterion of in what he calls joy, as opposed to pleasure, but you have to pay attention to what he calls in his Columbia lessons, the public ones. It's not the private one that were on knowledge, but the public one that were on ethics, joy, and practical consequences of philosophy. So Bergson is very clear. For colleagues, you speak of theory. For the greater public, you speak of practice. And what he wants to draw the attention to is that in mankind, you have two tendencies. One tendency that that is a tendency, to put it shortly, towards unity. And unity that is also universal peace. A tendency towards association, as Bergson puts it. And 20 years later, he would call that the tendency towards open society. He coined the phrase open society, open morality, open religion, universal ethics. The other tendency is a tendency towards disassociation, as we see in the summary. Disassociation, which is an incredible word, by the way. And Bergson very elliptically, in 1913, here in Columbia, says that the first tendency, the tendency towards association, will need, I quote, a long effort of will and genius. It meets some obstacles. Disassociation is the nature of humanity. War is the nature of humanity, as opposed to peace, which is the goal. And it is only in 1932 that he will explicitly state the opposition between the open and the closed, open morality and closed morality, open society and closed societies, and criticize war. Why is the gap so tragic? The gap is tragic because during the war, Bergson took part in the closed societies. Bergson made war speeches, very nationalist, mobilizing Elan Vital as French and the force of matter as German. And of course he was on the side of the closed. So This gap is very sort of not only theoretical but political in its own turn and has something tragic to it. But that's where occurs the third gap occurs. The gap between the mission here, the political mission that the French government gave him, and the account he gives in Mes Missions in 1936. What Bergson did here in America, going towards Wilson as an ambassador sent by the French government, he wanted to reconcile what was contradictory. What was contradictory? It was that he was philosophically for the universal, for peace, but politically he chose to be for France against Germany, to take part into this terrible intellectual war that the First World War was. I mean, you had French science against German science. Europe was divided not only politically but intellectually, and Bergson was part of that, just as Max Scheler in Germany. When he comes here, he finds in Wilson a hope, the hope that the political and the philosophical will really unite, and that's why he's so fascinated with Wilson's project for the Society of Nations. And after the war, as you know, Bergson did engage himself in Wilson's project, and he was the first director of what is now the UNESCO in Paris, the equivalent of the UNESCO in the SDN, Society of Nations, which is now the UNESCO for the United Nations Organization. Of course, Bergson's hope broke. The Society of Nations was not approved by the US Senate. Then Europe broke into fascism and totalitarianism. And in 1936, Bergson recognizes that the failure of Society of Nations gave way to the worst future to Europe. He uses the Latin phrase, corruptio optimi pessima. The destruction of the best gives the worst. And he recognizes that there was an obstacle. And that his own idealism in Wilson and Society of Nations was maybe an illusion. So we have three gaps. Bergson's new theory of knowledge that was published 20 years later, Bergson's closed and open society that was published 20 years later, and Bergson's idealism with democracy, Society of Nations, that was destroyed in the 30s, of course. So it's a gap in not only theory but practice. The question I want to ask to conclude is, are these gaps only failures? They have something of a failure, and they account for Bergson's, after the glory of Bergson, as one commentator put it in France recently, the decay of Bergson was very brutal because, of course, of these gaps. You have a vitalist Bergson, a nationalist Bergson, a skeptical Bergson apparently, and it was not good for the new generation after the First World War, but they didn't know that Bergson was not a rationalist, but had a theory of concept, that he was not a nationalist in philosophy, but has a philosophy of universal ethics and politics, and so forth. So the real Bergson was hidden under the political Bergson, the public Bergson. And so what I want to say to conclude is that this, there is a failure, there is a tragedy here, because of course the real Bergson was sort of hidden under the public activity. But the dualities in Bergson between concepts and intuitions, the closed and the open, Society of Nations and its obstacles, are no failure. They are really the best of his philosophy. What we have to know today is Bergson's internal tensions, that of course he advocates intuitions, but he also has a theory of concepts. That of course he advocates the open, but he knows that the closed is here. So our task today, I would say, is to take the full Bergson visit into account, that is, the full tensions in Bergson's philosophy, what he really said to his American public, that he has a theory of concepts and a theory of morality, but it took him 15 years to publicly state what he privately said orally here. And to conclude, I would say that this gap in time, this space in time, shows us that space and time, which is basically the major Bergsonian position, space and duration, as you space and time are not only a duality in the object of philosophy, in the object of Bergson's philosophy overall, it is also a duality in the practice of philosophy. Philosophy is a practice that in time with novelty, but it has also some space. It takes part into history. And this duality between space and time can bring to philosophy not only theoretical, but practical and sometimes tragical misunderstandings. But it can also bring to philosophy not only theoretical intuitions, but a practical power of orientation that I think is still of actuality today. That's where I want to be.
Now my pleasure to introduce our last panelist, who is Mathias Girel. Mathias is a professor of philosophy at École Normale Supérieure. He's a specialist of pragmatism in general, William James in particular. He wrote extensively in that field since his PhD at the Sorbonne on Peirce and pragmatism. And he recently actually organized in 2011, I believe, a conference on Dewey, so he was very much indicated to talk about the encounter between brackets between Dewey and Bergson during Bergson's visit. He's a member of the editorial board of Transactions of the Charles Sanders Peirce Society, also a member of the scientific committee for the European Journal of Pragmatism. And we were very lucky that Mathias was also, like Bergson, on a mission here in New York for this particular week when this panel was taking place. So we just grabbed him and he was generous enough to accept my invitation. So thank you.
I would like to share a perplexity tonight. It's the fact that we have many studies about Bergson and William James. We even have books now. We have studies about their respective accounts of truth and reality, of evolution, of the stream of consciousness, but oddly enough, we have nearly no studies about Dewey and Bergson and about their relationship. There is no Bergson entry in Westbrook's outstanding Dewey biography, and it also applies to a great deal of major monographies about Dewey. Still, there is evidence that Dewey had read closely some of Bergson's works just before Bergson came here in 1913, and he even asked in a 1912 review, who doesn't read Bergson today? So that's a kind of acknowledgement. And there was also evidence that he had criticisms of a major Bergsonian concept. And so the question I would like to ask is, what exactly is the philosophical counterpart of their physical meeting here 1 century ago in 1913? Because they met, but what can we find in Dewey's work that would be something like an acknowledgement of this meeting? As I said, he had read Bergson. He credits both James and Bergson to have placed change at the core of reality. Still, on the background of this reading and of this appraisal, he has some important philosophical reservations, some scruples, that must be mentioned insofar as they involve essential Deweyan tenets. I will give 2 samples tonight about knowledge and action, and if time permits, about intuition, that might explain why Bergson is important to Dewey, but also maybe why it's not that much present in Dewey's works in general. So first thing, that would be a short factual section just to give a sample of Dewey's text about Bergson, because the silence in the literature is very intriguing, because there are writings by Dewey about Bergson. We have a review in 1912, just before Bergson came, a very dense review of matter and memory, perception and organic action. The same year, Dewey wrote a short introduction to a bibliography of and about Bergson for a volume that was to be presented to Bergson during his stay here. It's short, but it's there. And during the war, he also wrote an unpublished piece that was finally found in 1965 and published by Girel de. It's a very nasty piece. It's Spencer and Bergson, and he claims that there is a kind of permanent Spencerian deposit in Bergson's works. It was not published during Dewey's lifetime, but it's an important piece. I think he also devoted a couple of lectures when he came to China in 1920. A couple of lectures to Bergson. He was in the distinguished company of William James and Bertrand Russell. It's difficult to use these lectures because, as you may know, they are significant as regards Bergson's prestige, but they must be approached with caution, since, as we know, we don't have the original manuscript. They were translated from the Chinese transcript, so as regards the philology of this text, it's very difficult to use them, and the editors of Dewey's collected works told that, I quote, "the possibility of error in this final text is beyond calculation," which is a kind of remarkable sobriety. Much later, Dewey reviewed the true sources in 1935, and just with this text we already have an important corpus, and one should also add the many scattered references in some of Dewey's major texts. I'm thinking in particular of human nature and conduct, of experience and nature, of art as experience. And there are quite a number of important developments in the monumental Dewey correspondence. There are letters to Cannon, to Bentley, to his students about panpsychism, about intuition, about knowledge. And Dewey tells a lot about Bergson, about Bergson and James, for example. And so, just if we look at the text, there should be some substance for a close study of Dewey's stance towards Bergson. And so that's still something to do, and it's still in order as far as the literature is concerned. But just maybe to start this exploration or this trailblazing, I will not be able to give a complete overview tonight. We might get a sample of Dewey's reading in 1912, just before Bergson came, by paying a short look at the review of matter and memory. It's interesting that Dewey shows this text because, as you know, creative evolution certainly struck many readers in the States, prompting James to call in correspondence Bergson a magician. And matter and memory was the text that Dewey chose. It was then just translated, and the topic of Dewey's review is actually perception, but his main qualm here lies with the account of reality and the account of action also. Dewey's thesis, first, as a familiar sound. It is that Bergson, contrasting reality as distorted and refracted from the standpoint of bodily needs on the one hand, and reality as grasped by a purely theoretical vision on the other hand, would have reintroduced dualism at the very core of philosophy. So it's a basic reading of Bergson at the time, but it's important to keep in mind that Dewey, in some way, entertained it. I quote just a few lines from the review. Dewey says, "A philosophy which holds that the facts of perception and science are to be explained from the standpoint of their connection with organically useful action, while it also holds that philosophy rests upon a radically different basis, is perforce a philosophy of reality that is already afflicted with a dualism so deep as seemingly to be ineradicable." So that's Dewey's stance at the time, just before Bergson came here. And diagnosing this tension might not be original with Dewey. Everyone, Dewey even claims, is aware that there is a tension, a twofold strain in Bergson's philosophy. The first strain where, quote, "perception, common sense knowledge, and science are explained on the ground of their intimate connection with action," unquote. And a second strain where most of our enduring philosophical fallacies are attributed to carrying over, I quote, over into metaphysics, the results and methods of the knowledge that has been formed with the exigencies of action in view, unquote. And so, in this view, the philosophical problems and the philosophical fallacies would be the long shadows cast by our actions in a domain where they don't belong. There would be their indirect effect. And so this twofold strain that Dewey diagnoses in Bergson is ultimately grounded on a strong opposition between knowledge and action. And as we can expect, Dewey would be glad to acknowledge just the first strain, the connection between perception, common sense and action, and to work at this level. The struggles he has are with the second one, the strain concerning philosophy and its proper object. Of course, according to Dewey, there are recurring philosophic problems and metaphysical fallacies, but they don't especially come from a deformation that would be exerted by the exigencies of action in general. On the contrary, these fallacies come from the fact that we generally tend to overlook that even our metaphysics is connected with our science and our common sense, and ultimately with action. And we miss that point precisely because we generally overlook the connection between science, perception, and action in the first place. The quest for certainty, for example, in 1929 will be entirely devoted to making that point, but it's already clearly articulated in the Bergson review. So according to Dewey, we are in dire need of a revision of the Office of Philosophy, a reconstruction of it, but there is no such thing as two kinds of knowledge, or for that matter, as two realms of the real. Giving up the spectator theory of knowledge, that is in some way presupposed by the opposition between knowledge and action, would help, according to Dewey, not only in dealing with the major problems of epistemology, but also with the metaphysical questions raised by science. So when you pay close attention to that review, Dewey objects both to the idea that there will be two such realms of reality, one distorted by the senses or by action, and another one. Two such realms of reality, as in itself and as distorted by the senses, and also he objects to the idea that our senses would shrink reality, so much so that there would be an excess of reality over the senses, on the senses, a pure presence that would be larger than what we interact with. There is more to reality than what can interact with us. That would be Bergson's argument, according to Dewey at that time. And this larger thing would be, for Dewey, a kind of unknowable that philosophy would do better to dispense with. On the contrary, according to Dewey, reading Bergson, action, interests, usefulness are integral parts of reality, and as such, they penetrate into it. They are part of reality. And a possibility that Dewey wants to explore is that when Bergson claims that in so doing our senses shrink or distort reality, this only attests to the fact that not that Bergson has a broader notion of reality, but that he has too narrow a concept of action. Of course, there are routines, there are blind actions, of course, but there are also actions with a broader scope, and Dewey wants to take them into account and to enlarge the picture. The main living problem for Dewey, when he reads Bergson, and that's still true for the several decades that were to come, the main living problem for Dewey is that of creative, collective, and intelligent action. He has a name for it, it's the public, as opposed to self-centered virtualities of action. So the problem is not with action in general, it's with the scope of action. And so the crucial division does not fall between knowledge and action. It doesn't fall between two kinds of reality. It falls between two scopes of action, more or less inclusive. Here is Dewey's main reply to Bergson in the review. Quote, genuine theoretic knowledge penetrates reality more deeply, not because it is opposed to practice, but because a practice that is genuinely free, social, and intelligent touches things at a deeper level than practice that is capricious, egoistically centered, sectarian, and bound down to routine, unquote. So that's Dewey's message to Bergson, and actually we have Bergson's reply and response to the review. And it's very interesting that the main clarification in Bergson's letter, so written at the beginning of January 1913, so the main clarification involves action. And there are two things in that reply. Bergson claims that he endorses a partial realism concerning geometry, and thus he acknowledges several realms of reality. And second, he remarks that he would not be ready to endorse a broader account of action than the one he had relied upon in matter, in memory. We have Bergson's answer. I'm just quoting a few lines. Concerning the topic of matter, I believe that the geometry which is contained and manifested in it is something real in itself, as we examine it at a much deeper level. That is why, here or elsewhere, it would be impossible for me to define all the reality in terms of action, unless one would expand a great deal the meaning of the word. I think this is the essential point which divides us. And so the validity of this expansion certainly is the main bone of contention here, and it looks like true philosophers agreed on their disagreement, which is quite rare in philosophy. I will add something on style, and maybe I will leave the things on intuition for the discussion so that we have time for questions. But just with that in mind, so the clarification on knowledge and action, the different stance toward action, it might be said, and it is a telling argument, that Dewey's review quotes mainly from the first chapter of Matter and Memory, that he has not taken into account Bergson's special way of argumenting. And such a reading is sketched, for example, in the short introduction to this letter that Mularkey provides in the new Bergson. And there is nothing surprising in that attention to the first chapter of Matter and Memory. Many readers have been struck by the philosophy of images displayed in that very chapter. And a reader of James's radical empiricism is bound to be very responsive to this aspect of Bergson's book. Still, as we know, and Frederick Worms has devoted a whole book to cast light on the structure and the dynamics of matter and memory, as well as a full chapter in Bergson et les deux sens de la vie, to the structure of matter and memory. The first chapter needs to be integrated in the whole structure of the book, and in particular, be connected with the last chapter. Be as it may, it's not the case that Dewey has been blind to this particular and transitory status of the first chapter of the book. And he has a remark on Bergson's style that I think interesting. He's quite aware that dualisms are not the last words in Bergson's thoughts, but he does not subscribe to the particular way they are overcome in Bergson, or for that matter, brought back to their point of emergence. And so he has a letter to Corinne Chisholm-Frost in 1937, so quite later than the review, but it's interesting because it's about Bergson's style, and I think it conveys a kind of exasperation, gentle exasperation towards the style, and I wish to share that. So he quotes Dewey about Bergson. These dualisms between intellect and intuition, the physical and the vital, are suggestive if taken to indicate the limits of a problem. But first, he takes them as final, and then he whittles down the differences till they tend to merge. And the particular way in which they are supposed to merge is often as irritating as his original dualisms. It is very hard to pin down, which accounts, I suppose, for why he is so much more suggestive than most writers and leaves one in something of a maze. So that's in private correspondence, it's not a published review, but Bergson's method with dualisms, Dewey argues in the next lines of the letter, leaves one oscillating. And Dewey adds, it's another quote, I think it's important, and then he tends, so Bergson, tends to set forth the oscillation as the fundamental truth, unquote. So the true philosophers would have a different take on dualisms. For Dewey, they generally refer to a fragmentation of action itself. If you face dualisms, that means that the action in which you take place is already fragmented for social or other practical reasons. And it prompts for a reconstruction of the situation. For Bergson, they would have to be followed, these terms of the dualism, until the point where both segments of the dualism merge into each other. And the oscillation Dewey detects could only, in his eyes, be the first word, and certainly not the last one. So there might be a difference about the philosophic style, about the general stance toward action. There are also important and telling differences, but I will not embark into them, on intuition, on élan vital. Dewey is quite wary of élan vital and human nature and conduct, but I would just like to give a few words in conclusion, so that we have time maybe for the discussion thereafter. The two men have met in 1913, so just after the review have been made, and they certainly agreed on more points than the ones, or the few ones, I had a chance to stress tonight. They obviously had many adversaries in common, and Bergson's views on art certainly surface in art as experience from time to time. Bergson's view of duration certainly also plays an important role in texts that just mention Bergson's name in passing. So we would have to take into account not only the explicit commentaries upon Bergson, but other texts that might have a Bergsonian twist, but even if they don't actually quote Bergson in detail. And I'm thinking of the very late text on time and individuality in one of the very last volumes of Dewey's collected works. Still, both men certainly men coming from different directions and having different agendas in mind. Even though Dewey is responsive to Bergson's account of the philosophical obsession with fixity, he thinks that Bergson did not wish or did not manage to break up with the traditional idea of knowledge as a complete possession and contemplation of its object. That's something we might qualify after Frederick's talk. And this was at odds with his own idea of the reconstructive task of philosophy. Assessing in which way it is true, so in which way Dewey's criticisms are deserved, would be a way to reopen their dialogue, a dialogue that started exactly here 1 century ago. Thank you.